The Warren family had fished the Mississippi for 4 generations. Their boat was everything: livelihood, legacy, the only thing standing between them and poverty. When the Budro crew stole it, they thought they were taking property. They were taking a death sentence. 12 men drowned in the waters of the Mississippi Delta over 11 nights in October 1976. The river kept their secrets. The Warren family kept their silence. This is the story of what happens when you steal from men who have nothing left but the water. The Mississippi River Delta, in the autumn of 1976, was a world unto itself, a place where water and land merged into something that was neither and both, where the boundaries that define geography elsewhere simply dissolved into endless miles of marsh and bayou, and the slow brown water that had been shaping this landscape for millennia. Plaquemines Parish occupied the final stretch of the river's journey to the Gulf, a narrow finger of land that extended south from New Orleans, bordered on both sides by water that seemed to press against the levees with patient, inexorable pressure. The towns that dotted this parish, Venice, Buras, Port Sulphur, Empire, were fishing communities in the truest sense, places where the economy was built almost entirely on what could be pulled from the water, where families had been working the same waters for generations, where the distinction between land and river was less a line than a gradual transition. The population of Plaquemines Parish was perhaps 25,000 in 1976, scattered across a landscape that discouraged concentration, that rewarded those who could navigate the maze of channels and bayous that branched off the main river like capillaries from an artery. Most residents were connected to the fishing industry in some way: commercial fishermen who worked the waters directly, processors who handled what they caught, boat builders and mechanics and suppliers who kept the fleet operating. The culture here was distinct from anything north of New Orleans, a blend of Cajun and Creole and the particular adaptations that living on water demanded. French was still spoken in many homes, the patois that had survived centuries of official discouragement, the language of family and intimacy, even when English was used for commerce and outsiders. The food was what the water provided: shrimp and crab and oysters, catfish and redfish, and the countless species that moved through these waters with the seasons. October brought changes that the river people understood intimately. The summer heat finally broke, temperatures dropping into the 70s during the day, the 50s at night, the air losing the oppressive humidity that made July and August almost unbearable. The fishing patterns shifted as species responded to cooling waters, some moving toward the Gulf, others moving upriver, the eternal cycles that had governed this place since before humans arrived. The smell of the delta was distinctive: salt and decay, and the particular richness of water that carried the sediment of half a continent, mud that was more alive than dead, constantly being deposited and redistributed by currents that never stopped moving. The sound was water lapping against holes and levees, birds calling across the marshes, the diesel engines of fishing boats heading out before dawn and returning after dark. The Warren family had been part of this world since 1894, when Isaiah Warren had arrived from somewhere upriver. The family history was vague on exactly where, and had established himself as a commercial fisherman working the waters around Venice. Isaiah had been a hard man by all accounts, solitary and driven, building his operation boat by boat, generation by generation, until the Warren name meant something in Plaquemines Parish. His son had expanded the operation, his grandson had consolidated it, and now his great-grandsons worked the waters that Isaiah had first navigated 82 years earlier, using knowledge and skills that had been passed down through 4 generations, understanding the river in ways that outsiders could never quite grasp. The current patriarch was Clement Warren, 63 years old in October 1976, though he'd stepped back from active fishing 5 years earlier when his back had finally given out after 4 decades of hauling nets and lifting crates. He still oversaw the operation, still made the major decisions, still commanded the respect that age and experience demanded in a community where such things mattered. The working core of the Warren operation was Clement's 4 sons: Abel at 49, the oldest, who'd taken over day-to-day management; Marcus at 46, who handled the mechanical aspects, keeping the boats and equipment functioning; Joseph at 44, who managed the sales and distribution side; and Samuel at 41, the youngest, who still worked the water every day, who knew the channels and currents better than anyone alive. These four brothers, plus their cousin Theodore Warren at 47, formed the crew that operated the family's primary asset, a 52-foot commercial fishing vessel named the Miss Catherine, after Clement's late wife, who had died in 1969. The Miss Catherine was not just a boat, she was the culmination of everything the Warren family had built over 4 generations, the physical embodiment of their place in the world. She'd been constructed in 1961 at a boatyard in Morgan City, built to specifications that Clement had developed over 30 years of fishing, incorporating every lesson he'd learned about what worked and what didn't in the demanding waters of the Delta. Her hull was steel, unusual for a boat her size, chosen for durability rather than speed, for the ability to withstand the punishment that commercial fishing inflicted. Her deck was wide and open, designed for the nets and traps and processing equipment that the work required. Her engine room held twin diesels that provided reliable power in conditions where reliability meant the difference between profit and disaster. Over 15 years of continuous operation, the Miss Catherine had been refined and improved until she was perfectly adapted to her purpose. The winches had been upgraded twice. The refrigeration system had been replaced entirely. The navigation equipment, primitive by later standards, was the best available in 1976 and had been installed at considerable expense. The boat was worth perhaps $80,000 in 1976 dollars, a substantial sum, but her value to the Warren family was incalculable. She was their primary source of income, the tool that allowed them to harvest the waters that sustained them. Without her, they would be reduced to working for others, to hiring onto boats owned by families who would take the lion's share of whatever the water provided. The Warren family's position in Venice was established but not dominant. They were respected, known for the quality of their work and the fairness of their dealings, but they weren't wealthy, weren't powerful, weren't connected to the political structures that governed the parish. They were simply commercial fishermen, doing what commercial fishermen had always done in these waters, surviving through skill and effort in an industry that offered little margin for error. Their operation was modest by the standards of the larger fleets that worked out of Venice and Empire. One primary boat, the Miss Catherine, supplemented by 2 smaller craft used for near-shore work and as tenders. A processing shed on leased land near the Venice Marina, where the catch was sorted and prepared for sale. Relationships with buyers in New Orleans who paid fair prices for quality product. The work was hard in ways that people who'd never done it couldn't understand. The fishing day began before dawn, often at 3 or 4 a.m., with preparation and transit to the fishing grounds. The work itself was physically demanding, setting nets, hauling catches, processing fish in conditions that were often cold, wet, and dangerous. The day ended after dark, with cleaning and maintenance that had to be completed before the next morning's work could begin. The income was unpredictable, dependent on factors that couldn't be controlled: weather, fish populations, market prices, the countless variables that made commercial fishing one of the most uncertain occupations in America. A good season could provide comfortable margins. A bad season could push a family to the edge of ruin. Most seasons fell somewhere in between, providing enough to survive, but never enough to feel secure. The Warren family had survived for 4 generations by being careful, by maintaining their equipment, by knowing the waters better than their competitors, by never taking more risk than they could absorb. They weren't getting rich, but they weren't going under either, which in commercial fishing was its own kind of success. The threat to this equilibrium arrived in the spring of 1976, in the form of the Boudreaux family and their ambitions. The Budro crew had operated out of Empire, 15 miles upriver from Venice, for perhaps a decade, building a reputation that mixed competence with something harder, something that made other fishermen uncomfortable. They were aggressive in ways that violated the unwritten codes that governed the fishing community, setting their nets in areas that others were working, undercutting prices to take customers from established relationships, using their numbers to intimidate smaller operators. The patriarch was Henri Boudreaux, 57 years old, a man whose success seemed to exceed what his skills and equipment should have produced, suggesting income sources that weren't entirely legitimate. His sons and nephews formed a crew of 8 or 9 men who worked together, who supported each other, who had a reputation for responding to any slight with disproportionate force. The conflict between the Warrens and Boudreaux had been building for years, the kind of slow-motion collision that everyone could see coming, but no one could prevent. It started with small incursions, Budro nets appearing in waters the Warrens had traditionally worked. Then disputes over buyers, with the Budro crew offering lower prices to capture customers the Warrens had supplied for years. Then direct confrontations on the water, shouting matches that stopped just short of violence, each incident adding to a pressure that had no obvious release. The Warrens had tried to avoid escalation. They'd adjusted their operations to stay clear of Budro territory, had absorbed the loss of some customers rather than fight for them, had swallowed provocations that their pride demanded they answer. Clement had counseled patience, had reminded his sons that fights on the water rarely ended well for anyone, that the Budro crew was larger and more willing to use force. But patience had limits, and in June 1976, those limits were exceeded. The incident occurred in the early morning hours of June 14th, in waters south of Baptiste Colette, an area the Warrens had been fishing for 3 generations. Abel and Samuel had set nets the previous evening, had returned at dawn to collect what the night had produced, had found their nets torn and empty, and a Boudreaux boat working the same area, its crew pulling in catches that should have belonged to the Warrens. The confrontation that followed was verbal, but intense. Abel accused the Boudreaux crew of cutting Warren nets, of stealing Warren fish. The Boudreaux men denied it, laughed at the accusation, suggested that the Warrens should find different waters if they couldn't compete. Words were exchanged that couldn't be taken back. Threats were made that would have to be remembered. By the time the boats separated, both families understood that something had changed, that the careful avoidance of the past years was no longer possible. The summer of 1976 was marked by escalating incidents. Boudreaux boats appearing wherever Warren boats operated. Equipment sabotaged, lines cut, nets damaged, small but costly violations that accumulated into substantial losses. Rumors spreading through the fishing community that the Warrens were finished, that they couldn't protect their territory, that anyone who wanted to take their business could do so without fear of consequence. The Warrens documented everything, reported some incidents to the parish sheriff, found that law enforcement had little interest in disputes between fishing families, that the resources for investigation simply didn't exist, that they were on their own against an enemy who had decided to destroy them. By September, the situation had become critical. The Warren operation had lost perhaps a third of its customers to Boudreaux competition. Equipment damage had cost thousands of dollars in repairs. The stress was affecting everyone. Abel's marriage was suffering. Marcus was drinking more than he should. Samuel had gotten into a fistfight with a Boudreaux cousin that had nearly escalated into something worse. Clement watched his sons struggle and saw his life's work being dismantled. Everything Isaiah had started, everything 4 generations had built, was being taken by a family that had decided to take it. He counseled patience because that was what patriarchs were supposed to counsel, but he understood that patience wasn't working, that the Boudreaux crew interpreted restraint as weakness, that every accommodation simply invited further aggression. The final provocation came on the night of September 28, 1976. The Miss Catherine was moored at her usual slip in the Venice Marina, tied up after a day of fishing, secured for the night, the way she'd been secured for 15 years. The Warren brothers had gone home to families and meals and the few hours of rest that the fishing life allowed. When Samuel arrived at 4 a.m. on September 29th to begin preparing for the day's work, the slip was empty. The Miss Catherine was gone. The initial assumption was that she'd somehow come loose, had drifted away from the dock, was floating somewhere in the marina or the channels beyond. Samuel searched, called his brothers, organized a search that expanded as the morning progressed. By noon, they found her. The Miss Catherine was 12 miles south, run aground on a mudflat in an area called Baie Ronquille, an area far from any route she might have drifted naturally. Her engines were cold, had been cold for hours, suggesting she'd been there since the previous night. Her navigation equipment had been smashed, her fuel tanks had been drained, her nets and processing equipment had been thrown overboard, scattered across the bay where the currents had carried them out of reach. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't drift. Someone had stolen the Warren family's boat, had deliberately damaged her, had left her where she'd be found. But where recovering her would be difficult and expensive, The message was clear. The Boudreaux crew was escalating beyond economic competition, beyond harassment, into something that crossed the line from rivalry into warfare. The damage assessment took 3 days. The Miss Catherine could be salvaged, could be repaired, but the cost would be substantial, perhaps $15,000 in 1976 dollars, money the Warren family didn't have, money they couldn't easily borrow, money that represented years of accumulated savings and future earnings. Without the boat, they couldn't work. Without work, they couldn't earn. Without earnings, they couldn't survive, couldn't maintain the operation that 4 generations had built, couldn't remain in the community that had been their home for 82 years. The Budro crew had taken more than a boat. They'd taken the Warren family's future. Clement called a meeting on the evening of October 1st, gathering his 4 sons and nephew at the family home on a ridge above the Venice Marina. The house was old, had been built by Clement's father in 1932, showed its age in sagging floors and walls that no longer met at proper angles. But it was home, the center of the Warren family's life, the place where decisions were made. The 5 men sat around the kitchen table where generations of Warrens had eaten and argued and planned. Clement was at the head, his authority unquestioned despite the frailty that age had brought. Abel sat to his right, the natural leader of the brothers, the one who would eventually take his father's place. Marcus, Joseph, and Samuel filled the other chairs. Theodore, the cousin, stood by the window, watching the darkness beyond. They discussed options that everyone knew were inadequate. Go to the law? The sheriff's department had shown no interest in fishing disputes. The evidence that the Budro crew was responsible was circumstantial, based on history and pattern, rather than proof. Even if charges were filed, the legal process would take months, would cost money they didn't have, would probably fail. Negotiate? With what leverage? The Budro crew had demonstrated their willingness to escalate. Any negotiation would be from a position of weakness, would result in terms that the Warrens couldn't accept. Sell out and leave? And go where? Do what? The Warren family knew fishing. They knew these waters. They had no other skills, no other options, no other place in the world. Fight back? With what? The Budro crew was larger, more aggressive, more willing to use violence. A direct confrontation would likely result in Warren casualties, would certainly result in criminal charges, would probably end with the family worse off than before. The conversation circled through these options for hours, each one examined and found wanting. The darkness outside deepened. The coffee grew cold. The desperation in the room became almost tangible. It was Samuel who finally spoke the words that everyone had been thinking, but no one had been willing to say. "We know the river better than they do," he said. His voice was quiet, almost calm, the voice of a man who had thought through something terrible and come out the other side. Everyone looked at him, understanding what he meant without needing explanation. "We know where the currents are," Samuel continued. "We know where things disappear, where things get found, and where they never do." The room was silent. The clock on the wall ticked through seconds that seemed to stretch into hours. Clement studied his youngest son, saw something in his eyes that he recognized from his own mirror, from the eyes of men who had been pushed past the point where normal rules applied. "What are you proposing?" Clement asked, though he already knew. Samuel's answer was simple, direct, and damning. "I'm proposing we take back what's ours, all of it, and make sure they can never take it again." The discussion that followed lasted until dawn. Every objection was raised and answered. Every risk was identified and weighed. Every moral consideration was examined and set aside. By the time the sun rose on October the 2nd, the Warren family had made their decision. The Boudreaux crew had 12 active members: Henri and his 2 sons, 5 nephews, 4 hired hands. 12 men who had participated in the systematic destruction of everything the Warrens had built, who had stolen their boat and their livelihood, who would continue to take until nothing remained. 12 men who needed to disappear. The river would help. The Mississippi had been hiding secrets for longer than humans had lived on its banks. It carried bodies to the Gulf, deposited them in marshes where they'd never be found, consumed evidence with the patient efficiency of water that never stopped moving. The Warren family knew this river, knew its currents and its depths, its hiding places and its hungers. They would use that knowledge now, for purposes that 4 generations of fishing had never anticipated. The preparations began the same day. The planning took 6 days, longer than impatience wanted but necessary for what they intended to accomplish. Abel took the lead, his experience managing the fishing operation translating to this darker purpose. He approached the problem systematically, breaking it into components that could be addressed individually, building a plan that minimized risk while maximizing effectiveness. The first challenge was intelligence. The Warren family needed to know the movements and patterns of every Boudreaux crew member, needed to identify moments of vulnerability that could be exploited, needed to understand the organization well enough to dismantle it without anyone escaping. This intelligence came from the fishing community itself. The Warrens had relationships built over decades, contacts who trusted them, people who had their own reasons to dislike the Budro crew. Careful questions, asked in the right way, produced information that accumulated into a comprehensive picture. Henri Boudreaux lived in a house outside Empire with his wife, who rarely left the property. His sons, Claude and Philippe, lived nearby with their own families. The nephews and hired hands were scattered across the parish, some in Empire, some further afield, each with patterns that could be observed and predicted. The Budro crew worked from 3 boats, ranging in size from a small skiff to a 40-foot trawler that was their primary vessel. They fished various waters depending on season and opportunity, but certain areas were favorites, and their schedules followed patterns that observation revealed. Marcus handled the logistical preparation, gathering equipment that would be needed without attracting attention. Rope, chain, weights. Materials that any fishing operation used regularly that wouldn't raise questions if purchased in normal quantities over several days. He checked and maintained the family's boats, ensured that engines and equipment were functioning perfectly, prepared for operations that would demand reliability. Joseph worked on alibi construction, creating frameworks that would provide deniability if questions were ever asked. Fishing trips that family members were supposedly on. Equipment repairs that supposedly required all-night work. The ordinary activities of the fishing life, arranged to explain absences and provide cover. Samuel continued his reconnaissance of the waters where the operation would occur. He mapped currents and depths, identified locations where bodies could be deposited with confidence that the river would complete the concealment. He tested theories about how the water moved, how long objects took to travel from point to point, where things accumulated, and where they were carried toward the Gulf. Theodore, the cousin, served as coordinator and backup, ready to assist wherever he was needed, providing the additional hands that some aspects of the operation would require. Clement oversaw everything, his decades of experience identifying problems that his sons might miss, his authority settling disputes when disagreements arose. He didn't participate in the physical planning, his age and infirmity precluded that, but his approval was required for every major decision, his judgment the final word on matters of timing and risk. The plan that emerged was simple in concept, complex in execution. The Boudreaux crew would be taken one at a time or in small groups, isolated from backup and witnesses, incapacitated and delivered to the river that would ensure they were never found. The operations would occur at night, in waters that the Warrens knew and the Boudreaux crew didn't know as well, using the advantages of terrain and knowledge that generations of fishing had provided. Each target would be approached differently, the method adapted to circumstances and opportunity. Some would be taken on the water, their boats intercepted in isolated channels. Others would be taken on land, at locations where they could be subdued without witnesses. A few would require more elaborate arrangements, lures that would draw them to places where the Warren family would be waiting. The goal was complete elimination. Not just Henri and his sons, but every member of the crew, every person who had participated in the campaign against the Warrens, every potential witness or avenger who might cause problems later. 12 men removed from the world as if they had never existed, their disappearances attributed to the countless hazards that the river and the fishing life presented. The operation began on the night of October 7th, 1976. The first targets were 2 of the hired hands, men named Thibodeau and Melançon, who worked a small boat together and who had been observed doing night fishing in an isolated area of Baie Bastien, far from other activity. Abel and Samuel intercepted them around 11 p.m., approaching in a boat running without lights, using knowledge of the currents to arrive silently. The hired hands were focused on their nets, didn't realize danger was present until the Warren boat was alongside. The confrontation was brief. Thibodeau reached for a knife, received a blow to the head that left him unconscious. Melançon tried to flee, dove into the water, was caught before he could swim 10 yards. Both men were bound, weighted, and delivered to a location Samuel had identified during his reconnaissance, a deep channel where the current ran strong toward the Gulf, where nothing deposited ever resurfaced. The bodies would never be found. The Warren brothers were confident of that. The river would do its work, carrying the evidence far from where questions might be asked. 2 down, 10 remaining. The disappearance of Thibodeau and Mélenchon was noticed within 2 days. Their boat found drifting in the area where they'd been fishing. No sign of the men who'd been operating it. The assumption in the fishing community was accident. Men fell overboard. Equipment failed. The hazards of the trade claimed victims regularly. The Boudreaux crew mourned briefly and moved on, replacing the lost men with new hires, continuing operations that they assumed were unrelated to the disappearance. The second operation targeted a nephew named Landry, who had a reputation for working alone, who was known to fish night waters by himself, despite the obvious risks. He was taken on October 10th in a bayou south of Port Sulphur. Approached by a boat he assumed was friendly until it was too late. Landry fought harder than the first two, had time to understand what was happening, screamed questions that the Warren brothers didn't answer. The struggle left Marcus with a gashed arm that would need stitches, a wound that would be explained as an equipment accident. But the outcome was the same. Another body delivered to the river, another disappearance that would be attributed to the dangers of the trade. 3 down, 9 remaining. The pattern continued through the following days. On October 12th, 2 more nephews, brothers named Arsenault, were taken while running a trap line in an isolated marsh. They had been careless about security, had assumed that the earlier disappearances were coincidence, hadn't considered that they might be targets of systematic elimination. On October 14th, a hired hand named Boudreaux was intercepted on a road outside Empire, returning from a bar where he'd drunk enough to slow his reactions. He was bundled into the Warren truck, driven to a location on the river, delivered to the waters that would complete the work. 6 down, 6 remaining, including Henri himself and his 2 sons. The Budro crew was becoming nervous now. Too many disappearances, too close together, too concentrated within their organization. Henri ordered his remaining men to travel in groups, to avoid isolated locations, to arm themselves against whatever threat they were facing. But they still didn't understand the scope of what they were facing, didn't realize that the threat was systematic, that someone had decided to eliminate their entire organization, that every member was a target regardless of precautions. The Warren family adapted to the increased security, looking for opportunities that the new caution might miss, exploiting vulnerabilities that remained despite Henri's orders. On October 16th, they struck at the heart of the organization. Claude Boudreaux, Henri's older son, was the primary target. Intelligence suggested that Claude would be attending a card game in Buras that evening, an event he never missed, a weakness in his schedule that couldn't be eliminated without arousing suspicion. Theodore waited outside the location where the game was held, watching for Claude's departure. Abel and Samuel positioned themselves along the route Claude would take home, at a curve in the road where stopping was natural and witnesses were unlikely. Claude left the game around midnight, driving alone because the partners who might have accompanied him had already disappeared into the river. He stopped when he saw the disabled vehicle blocking his path, got out to investigate, never saw the men approaching from the darkness behind. The struggle was brief. Claude was larger than the Warren brothers had expected, fought with a desperation that suggested he understood what was happening, but 4 men against 1, with the advantage of surprise, produced the inevitable outcome. Claude Boudreaux was delivered to the river before dawn. His vehicle was driven to a different location, abandoned where it would suggest flight rather than foul play. By the time his family realized he was missing, the Mississippi had carried him far from where questions might be answered. 7 down, 5 remaining. Henri Boudreaux finally understood what was happening. His son was gone, disappeared like 6 of his men before, vanished without explanation or evidence. The pattern was too clear now to be denied. Someone was systematically eliminating his organization, picking off his people one by one, using methods that left no witnesses and no proof. He suspected the Warrens immediately. The history between the families, the theft of the boat, the timing of the disappearances, it all pointed to the quiet fishing family he'd thought he could push aside without consequence. But suspicion wasn't proof, and even if Henri went to the law, what could he say? That his rivals were killing his men? Based on what evidence? The sheriff would ask questions that Henri couldn't answer without implicating himself in the theft of the Miss Catherine in the years of harassment that had preceded it. Henri Boudreaux was trapped. He couldn't go to the authorities. He couldn't identify his attackers with certainty. He could only try to protect himself and his remaining people while the invisible threat continued its work. He gathered his surviving crew, his younger son Philippe, 2 nephews, a hired hand, and announced that they would stay together, would operate as a unit, would watch each other's backs until the threat could be identified and eliminated. It was the right instinct, executed too late. The Warren family had anticipated this reaction, had planned for the moment when the remaining Budro would consolidate, would try to find safety in numbers. The final operation occurred on the night of October 18, 1976. Intelligence indicated that Henri and his remaining crew would be at the Budro compound in Empire, gathered for a meeting to discuss their situation. The property was isolated at the end of a road that saw little traffic, surrounded by marsh that provided both concealment and barriers to escape. All 5 Warren men participated in the assault: Abel, Marcus, Joseph, Samuel, and Theodore. They approached from the water, using the skills that 4 generations of fishing had developed, moving through channels that the Budro might not even know existed. The compound was lit, activity visible through windows, vehicles parked in the front suggesting that all 5 remaining Budro were present. The Warren family circled the property, identified positions, coordinated their approach through hand signals developed during years of working together on the water. The assault began at 2:17 a.m. Marcus and Theodore took the back entrance, cutting power to the building as they moved, plunging the compound into darkness. Abel and Samuel came through the front, moving fast, using the confusion to close distance before the Budro could organize resistance. Joseph covered the vehicles, ensuring that no one could escape by road, that the only exit was toward the water where the Warren boats waited. The fighting lasted less than 10 minutes. Henri Boudreaux died in his kitchen, reaching for a shotgun he never managed to fire. Philippe died in the hallway, caught between the front and back assault, overwhelmed before he could choose a direction to run. The nephews died in the rooms where they had been sleeping, roused by the noise but too slow to react effectively. The hired hand, a man named Fontenot, 26 years old, the youngest of all the victims, tried to flee through a window, made it to the marsh, was caught by Samuel within 50 yards. He begged for his life in the darkness, promised silence, offered anything he could think of. Samuel finished him anyway, understanding that mercy now would mean exposure later. 12 men, 11 nights. The Budro organization was gone. The bodies were collected, loaded onto the Warren boats, transported to locations across the delta, where the river would complete the concealment. The compound was cleaned, evidence removed, the scene arranged to suggest flight rather than violence. Vehicles were driven to distant locations and abandoned. Everything that might point to what had happened was eliminated or dispersed. By dawn on October 19th, the Warren family had returned to their homes, had established the alibis that had been prepared, had begun the process of resuming normal life as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The Miss Catherine was recovered and repaired over the following weeks. The insurance money supplemented by cash the family had saved. The boat returned to service before November ended. The Warren operation resumed, customers returning once the Boudreaux competition had mysteriously disappeared, the business recovering as the family had known it would once the threat was eliminated. 12 men had vanished from Plaquemines Parish. The river kept its secrets. The Warren family kept theirs. The disappearances were noticed, of course. 12 men didn't vanish from a community of 25,000 without someone noticing. But the noticing happened gradually, in stages that never quite accumulated into the critical mass that would trigger serious investigation. The first disappearances, Thibaudeau and Mélenchon, were attributed to the ordinary hazards of the fishing life. Their boat was found, equipment apparently failed, the men presumably drowned. Tragic, but not unprecedented. Fishing claimed lives every year. As the disappearances continued, concern grew within the Boudreaux family. But that concern wasn't immediately shared with authorities. Henri's business had aspects that didn't bear official scrutiny. Calling attention to his organization meant calling attention to activities that might result in questions he didn't want to answer. By the time the final assault eliminated Henri himself, the survivors who might have gone to police were dead. The Boudreaux family's legitimate members, wives, children, elderly relatives, knew that something terrible had happened, but didn't know exactly what or who was responsible. Their suspicions when they developed them were based on rumor and inference rather than evidence. Sheriff's Deputy Raymond Trosclair was assigned to investigate the disappearances when they finally accumulated enough official notice to require response. He was 34 years old, had been with the Plaquemines Parish Sheriff's Office for 8 years, had investigated disappearances before in a parish where the water claimed people with some regularity. What he found was puzzling but not conclusive. 12 men connected to the same fishing operation had disappeared over an 11-day period. Some disappearances had explanations that, while tragic, were plausible: fishing accidents, equipment failures, the hazards of the trade. Others were harder to explain, but the absence of evidence made investigation nearly impossible. No bodies were ever recovered. The Mississippi had done its work, carrying the evidence far out into the Gulf, dispersing it across thousands of square miles of water, where recovery was impossible. No witnesses came forward. The Warren family's operations had been conducted with care, at times and in places where observation was unlikely. Anyone who might have seen something had seen nothing that they recognized as significant. No physical evidence tied anyone to the disappearances. The crime scenes, such as they were, had been cleaned or never existed at all. The methods used left no traces that investigation could detect. Deputy Trosclair suspected the Warren family, the timing, the history, the pattern of disappearances affecting only Budro crew members. It all pointed in their direction. He interviewed Abel and Samuel, found them cooperative and unhelpful, their answers consistent with innocence that he didn't believe but couldn't disprove. The investigation continued for months, generated paperwork that filled filing cabinets, produced no arrests and no charges. By the spring of 1977, it had effectively ended, classified as unsolved, attributed officially to a series of tragic accidents that had befallen a single fishing operation through extraordinary but not impossible bad luck. The fishing community knew better, of course. In the bars and on the docks, in the conversations that happened when outsiders weren't present, people talked about what they believed had happened. The Warren family had eliminated the Budro crew, had done so with a thoroughness that commanded respect even as it inspired fear, had sent a message that everyone in Plaquemines Parish understood. You didn't steal from the Warrens, you didn't push them, you didn't threaten their livelihood or their future, because if you did, you discover that 4 generations of river knowledge could be applied to purposes that fishing had never intended. This understanding, never spoken directly but always present, protected the Warren family more effectively than any alibi or evidence destruction. No one wanted to be the person who provided information that might bring the law down on the Warrens, because no one wanted to be the next person who disappeared into the river. The Warren family resumed their lives as if nothing had happened. The Miss Catherine returned to service. In November 1976, her damage repaired, her equipment replaced, her hull once again cutting through the waters that had sustained 4 generations of Warren fishermen. The operation recovered quickly once the Budro competition was gone, customers returning, revenues stabilizing, the future that had seemed destroyed now seemingly secured. Clement Warren watched his sons rebuild what had been taken, saw the operation return to health, felt something that might have been satisfaction or might have been something darker that he preferred not to examine too closely. He'd approved what they'd done, had understood the necessity, had authorized the violence, had accepted responsibility for 12 deaths that would weigh on whatever soul he had for whatever time remained to him. The choice had been between destruction and survival, and he'd chosen survival, the same choice his ancestors had made countless times in the hard life that the Delta demanded. Whether it was the right choice, whether any other choice had been possible, whether the cost in blood was worth the benefit in continuity, these questions didn't have clean answers. Clement had stopped looking for clean answers decades ago. His sons carried the weight in their own ways. Abel became more religious after October 1976, attending Mass regularly for the first time since childhood, seeking something in the rituals and prayers that might address what he'd done. He never confessed, not to a priest and not to anyone else, but he prayed. And perhaps that helped. Perhaps it didn't. He never said. Marcus drank more than he had before, the alcohol serving purposes that he didn't want to articulate. He remained functional, continued to maintain the boats and equipment that the operation required, but there was something missing in him now, something that had been present before October, and that the river had taken along with the 12 men he'd helped to kill. Joseph, who had participated less directly in the violence, seemed least affected. He continued managing sales and distribution, continued building relationships with buyers, continued doing the work that he'd always done. If the events of October troubled him, he didn't show it, and no one asked. Samuel was perhaps the most changed. The youngest brother had proposed the solution, had participated in every operation, had finished men who begged for their lives with the same efficiency he brought to finishing fish. Something had been revealed about himself during those 11 nights, something he couldn't unravel, something that would be part of him forever. He continued fishing, continued working the waters he knew better than anyone, but there was a distance in him now that hadn't been there before. He married in 1978, had children, built a life that looked from the outside like any other fisherman's life. Inside was something different, something that his wife sensed but couldn't name, something that his children would inherit without: understanding. Theodore, the cousin, left Plaquemines Parish in 1979, moved to Texas, started over in a place where no one knew his name or his history. The separation from his family was painful, but the memories were more painful, and distance was the only remedy he could find. Clement Warren died in the winter of 1981, at the age of 68. The cancer had been growing for 2 years by the time it was diagnosed, had spread too far for treatment by the time doctors saw it. He died in the house his father had built, surrounded by his sons, looking out at the water that had given his family everything and taken things in return. His final words were instructions about the operation, reminders about maintenance schedules and customer relationships. The concerns of a businessman who had spent his entire life building something and didn't want to see it fail. He said nothing about October 1976, about the 12 men who had died, about the choice he'd authorized and the burden his sons would carry forever. Some things didn't need to be spoken, some things were better left in the silence that the river had taught. The funeral was held at the Catholic Church in Venice that the Warren family had attended for 4 generations. The attendance was larger than the modest church could comfortably hold, fishermen and their families coming to pay respects to a man who had represented something in this community: continuity, tradition, the stubborn persistence that survival on the Delta demanded. No one mentioned the Boudreaux family. No one spoke of the disappearances that had occurred 5 years earlier. The eulogy focused on Clement's life as a fisherman and father, on the family he'd raised and the legacy he'd built, on the qualities that made a man worthy of remembrance in a community that valued self-reliance above almost everything else. But everyone present understood that Clement Warren was being mourned not just as a fisherman, but as the patriarch of a family that had done something remarkable, something terrible, something that had protected their way of life at a cost that would be paid for generations. The investigation into the Budro disappearances was never officially closed, but it faded into the archives of the Plaquemines Parish Sheriff's Office, one of many unsolved cases in a parish where the water kept secrets and the people who lived near it kept more. Deputy Trosclair, who had led the investigation, retired in 1989. In his final years, he occasionally spoke to researchers and journalists about cases that had never been solved, and the Boudreaux disappearances were always mentioned. "I know what happened," Trosclair would say. "I've always known, but knowing and proving are different things. The river doesn't leave evidence, and the people who live on it know how to use that." He would shake his head, the frustration of decades still visible. 12 men died because they stole a fishing boat, because they thought they could take from people who had nothing else. They were wrong, and the river made sure we'd never prove it. The Warren family continued fishing the Mississippi Delta for decades after October 1976. Abel took over the operation after Clement's death, ran it until his own retirement in 1995. The Miss Catherine remained in service until 1992, when age and the demands of modern regulations finally made replacement necessary. The new boat was named the Miss Catherine II. The tradition continued, the connection to the past maintained. Marcus died in 1997, liver disease that decades of drinking had made inevitable. Joseph died in 2003, heart attack, sudden and unexpected. Samuel continued fishing until 2008, when he finally retired at the age of 73, the last of the brothers to leave the water that had been their life. He died in 2019 at the age of 84 in a nursing home in Boudreaux, where the staff knew him only as a quiet old man who had been a fisherman once, who sometimes stared at the water visible from his window with an expression that no one could read. The Warren family's fishing operation continues today, run by grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the men who participated in the events of October 1976. They fish the same waters their ancestors fished, use techniques passed down through generations, maintain the quality and reputation that Isaiah Warren established in 1894. They know the family history, the parts that are spoken and the parts that aren't. The story of October 1976 is told in fragments, in references that don't require explanation, in the understanding that some things happened that can never be undone and should never be repeated. They're careful about their dealings with other fishing families. Respectful, aware that the Warren name carries associations that both protect and burden those who bear it. They don't provoke, don't escalate, don't put themselves in positions where the choices their grandfathers made might have to be made again, because those choices were terrible, necessary perhaps given the circumstances, effective certainly given the outcome, but terrible in ways that can't be forgotten, that shouldn't be forgotten, that remain part of the Warren legacy forever. The river remembers, even when people try to forget. The Mississippi River carries more than water to the Gulf. It carries sediment from half a continent, the soil of 31 states washing toward the sea. It carries debris from 1,000 miles of human habitation, the garbage and runoff of modern civilization mixing with the natural flow. It carries history, the accumulated memories of everyone who ever lived along its banks, the stories that were told and the ones that weren't. And it carries secrets, the things that were given to it in darkness, the evidence that was entrusted to its currents, the truth that was buried in its depths. In October 1976, 12 men were given to the river. Their bodies were carried toward the Gulf, dispersed across the delta, consumed by the processes of decay and current that the Mississippi has employed for millennia. No trace of them was ever recovered. No evidence of what happened to them was ever found. The river kept its secrets, as it always has. Nearly 50 years have passed since those 11 nights. The world has changed in ways that the Warren brothers could never have imagined. The fishing industry has transformed, technology replacing tradition, corporations replacing families, the old ways fading into memory and museum. Plaquemines. Parrish is different now. Hurricane Katrina devastated the area in 2005. The water that had sustained the community becoming the force that nearly destroyed it. The population is smaller, the fishing fleet reduced, the way of life that Clement Warren knew existing now, only in fragments and remembrances. But the Warren family remains, diminished, changed, adapted to circumstances that their ancestors couldn't have foreseen, but still present, still connected to the water that gave them everything. The current generation knows the story, or knows what their parents chose to tell them. They understand that something happened in 1976, that 12 men disappeared, that the river was involved in ways that can't be fully explained. They don't know the details. Those details died with the men who knew them, but they understand the shape of the truth, the weight of the history that they carry. They don't talk about it with outsiders. When researchers or journalists occasionally appear, asking questions about the Budro disappearances, they're met with the same polite refusals that Plaquemines Parish has offered for decades. The community closes around its secrets, protects its own, maintains the silence that is held for half a century. What would you do if someone took everything you had? The question has no easy answer, no clean resolution, no moral that can be applied to other situations. The Warren family answered it in their way, with violence and efficiency and a willingness to do what survival demanded. Were they right, wrong, justified, criminal? The labels don't capture the reality. The reality is that 12 men tried to take what the Warren family had built over 4 generations, and 12 men paid for that choice with their lives. The reality is that the Warren family continues, their legacy intact, their future secured by actions that can never be undone. The reality is that the river keeps its secrets, and the people who live on it keep theirs. In the small cemetery outside Venice, where generations of Warrens are buried, the headstones offer no clues to what happened in 1976. Clement's grave is there, beside his wife Catherine, who died in 1969. His sons are there now, too. Abel and Marcus and Joseph and Samuel, their stones recording dates of birth and death, but nothing of the 11 nights that defined their lives. They took their secrets to their graves. The river took theirs to the Gulf. What remains is silence and memory, and the understanding that some things can never be fully known. The Mississippi flows past Venice, as it always has, brown and slow and powerful, carrying the wealth of a continent toward the sea. Fishing boats work its waters, smaller fleets now than before, but still present, still pulling from the river what it chooses to give. The Warren boats are among them. Different vessels than the Miss Catherine, different technology, different people at the helm, but the same waters, the same tradition, the same family that has been fishing here for over a century. They know what the river knows. They carry what the river carries, and they keep their silence as the river keeps its, while the currents flow on toward the Gulf, carrying secrets that will never be revealed, hiding truth that will never be told. The Mississippi remembers October 1976. The Warren family remembers too. That's the only justice that was ever possible, the only truth that the waters will ever yield. 12 men drowned in these waters, and the river took them, and the silence has held for nearly 50 years. Some stories end with resolution, some end with punishment, some end with the moral clarity that we want from our narratives. This one ends with the river, still flowing, still keeping its secrets, still carrying whatever is given to it toward the vast and indifferent sea. If this story made you think about what you would do to protect what's yours, about the secrets that rivers keep, and the silences that communities maintain, share it with someone who needs to understand. Not because it's entertainment, because it's a mirror. The Warren family looked into that mirror in 1976 and saw what they were capable of. They made their choice. They lived with it until they died. The river carries many things, evidence, bodies, truth, but it never carries them back.